Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Oxford Internet and Policy Conference. We can start our first discussion for today, which is about the Nordic case of electronic IDs and their implications for digital equality. This talk is going to be hosted by Professor Søren Skarup, and he's joined by his colleagues Annika Bergviken and by Carl Erik. Søren, he's a professor from the University of Copenhagen. His career has been in the crossroads between services, communication, technology, and design. And he has approached this field from a political and a strategic approach and a hands-on operational and managerial perspective, always with a strong focus on innovation. We're very happy to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. And on these online events, I never know what to say. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Yeah. We lack a word in English that sort of covers the whole day, don't we? Yeah. But anyway, good, whatever time you're at right now. My name is Søren, and I'm presenting today, and I'm joined online by Annika Bergviken and Carl Erik Mo, who have my co-authors, and they will take part in the discussion and answering questions after my presentation. I'm very excited to see if this works. It actually works. This is our work is part of a larger project, the SOS project, which is a collaboration between a number of universities in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, and funded by the Norforsk Foundation. And I myself I'm at the Center for Digital Welfare at the IT University of Copenhagen. The whole idea of the SOS project is to look at the infrastructures for partially digital citizens, and also to look at how the informal welfare work that is carried out by frontline workers and others is happening. Much of that is very invisible and not very well studied. We base this particular study on electronic IDs in the Nordic countries. And in particular, we aim to examine the implications of intersecting inclusionary aspects for citizens in the encounter with digital public services. Now, our focus is on the public sector for a number of reasons, but many of these issues are found in interactions with the private sector online as well. Just briefly, sort of a status on internet use in Scandinavia. We have a high degree of internet use. 96 to 98% of the population have access to the internet in one way or the other. More than 90% of internet users in the age group 16 to 74 report using digital public services. Not every day, of course, but at some point during the year. It's important to remember, I used to work in the public sector, and I always had to remind myself and my colleagues that while the citizens, they take out a large part of the horizon when you work in the public sector is not quite as visible when you're a citizen. So we're not as important as we think. Denmark is a special case because in Denmark, it's mandatory to be digital. We have something called digital post, is where you exchange emails and documents with government. And this goes for citizens as well as private sector companies. It's simply the only way, there are exemptions, but this is basically the way to communicate with government. And the same goes for government self-service systems. If you want to apply for something or want to file something, you have to do it online. Exemptions are possible, as I said. 7% of the adult population are exempt from digital post. That goes for 15% of those over 55. It's also possible to be exempt from self-service, but that's a bit more complicated. It's on a case-by-case basis. So even if you have an exemption from digital post, you're not automatically exempt from self-service. And one of the issues, which I will return to, is that the alternatives to being digital are often very cumbersome, difficult. Sometimes the staff doesn't even know how to do it. And finally, it is becoming in all three countries, even though it's only mandatory in Denmark, in all three countries, we really follow a digital first strategy. And access through other channels like phone or face-to-face has been reduced, both with regards to accessibility. There are fewer places you can go to. The opening hours are shorter. In Denmark, if you want to go to a citizen service center, you have to book a time slot. The waiting times are longer on the phone and face-to-face. If you are exempt from digital post and send a good old-fashioned letter, things can take a lot longer. Not just because the post is slower than it used to be, but also because the whole process around the physical is a sort of sideline, something they do when they have the time. That's how, at least how it seems to citizens. So filing deadlines and stuff like that can be difficult to meet if you are not online. We also see a decrease in quality. This has not been studied, so this is more like a sense that we get from talking to frontline workers and to citizens. There is a degree of de-skilling at the front lines. So the people that citizens actually meet face-to-face or on the phone, they know less and are less empowered to do stuff than they used to. And also they are very often have the role of gatekeepers. So they are supposed to sort of take care of as much as possible to avoid having to put you through to the people in the back office that actually knows something. Of course, they're not stupid. They know, but they're limited in their knowledge because the knowledge is very much focused to sort of answering questions and helping people being digital. And they're also limited in what they're allowed to do. They don't have any influence on the cases themselves, or they can't extend the deadline, for instance, or somehow introduce a degree of flexibility. They're very bound by the procedures and the systems they use. So it has become increasingly difficult not being digital. Access really does not equal equality. And we know that this is nothing new, but still in the public discourse, at least in Scandinavia, it's still a very strong motive that when people have access, then they are online. But they may have access, but they may be very limited in what they do online. They may do some things very intensely and some things they may never do. So internet connections and saturation rates and degrees of internet use do not remove the basic challenges of digital divides and inequalities. It makes some things possible that wouldn't be possible without it, but they're only possible. To actually use those possibilities to do something requires a lot more. The consequences of all this are not well understood. In Denmark, during the last 10 years, we did a lot of really big fundamental changes in the way citizens interacted with government. We made online interaction mandatory. We reduced the possibilities for face-to-face access. We centralized a number of services, so it's impossible for many of the basic government benefits. You simply cannot meet anyone face-to-face. And this consecutive set of changes has a lot of consequences, but they have not really been studied. They haven't really been a focus of political discussion. And this is, of course, great when you're a scholar because there's lots of stuff to do, but it's a real problem because it's not on the agenda of decision makers. It has in the last couple of years, sort of the rhetoric about talking about inequalities have come on the agenda, but with no real effect yet. It hasn't really trickle down into actual policy. So we don't really see, they've very recently started talking about strengthening equality. but so far it's very sort of vague what they actually want to do about it. And as I'll get back to in a moment, it's because they basically frame the issues in a way that's not very helpful. Of course, we hope as researchers to be able to provide them with data and research that can help them to reframe it. Now to the main issue here, which is EIDs. In Sweden, 91% of the population over 16 or more report having used EID services during 2022. 71% report using them on a daily basis. 10% have not accessed EIDs, and this is mainly elderly people. In Denmark, 92% of Danes over 15 have what we call, it used to be called NemID. It's just changed to MitID, which means my ID. It is used for banking, for government services, including health services, for secure online payments, and access to a long range of private services. It's becoming very ubiquitous. And in Norway, 94% of Norwegians over 13 have a bank ID, and 95% of Norwegians over 16 use digital banking services. And here it's also used for banking and government service and a number of private sector services, including health services and secure online payment. So it is very difficult to go about your daily lives without an EID. Now, one of the reasons why you have such a high penetration of EIDs is, of course, that in all the Nordic countries, we have a centralized system where everybody has what in some countries is called a social security number. In Denmark, it's a personal identification number. You get one at birth, or if you move to Denmark, and it is the sort of the thing that everything else is connected to. And that, of course, makes a lot of things easier. That's one of the reasons why the Nordic countries are pretty far ahead on government digitization, that we had all these basic systems in place long before we started involving the citizens. Now, the setup of these EIDs are quite different. In Sweden, Bank ID, it's in the name, is owned by the major banks. There is an alternative called Fire ID, which is a private listed company. So the whole infrastructure is privately owned. It's used by government, but it's privately owned. In Denmark, MitID is owned by a partnership between the public sector and the Danish banks. There are no alternatives, there's only this one. But within the system, there are several identity brokers are possible. I won't get into the technical sides of this, but seen from the citizens and from the companies that use it, there's only one, and it's MitID. But this when we introduced the previous version of it, NemID, from the beginning, it's been a cooperation between the banks and the government, which has been quite a success, but also, of course, they sort of sometimes they tie each other down. So the things one part would like to do that the other part don't. So, but so far it has been a solid foundation. In Norway, it's also a bank ID owned by the Norwegian banks. There are a couple of alternatives, but supplied by private companies, but they're not used very much. So in Sweden and Norway, the whole infrastructure is privately owned. In Denmark, the government has a big say in it, but the banks, of course, have a veto, so to speak. So there are things that they want that has to be done. Now, what does it require to get an EID? There are technical requirements, of course. We have to have a computer, a smartphone, or a tablet, which can run recent versions of OSs and browsers. That's for security reasons, of course. You have to have a fairly updated system in order for it to be secure at all times. If you want to use it on a smartphone, of course, you need a mobile plan. If you don't have a smartphone, you can use a PIN code calculator. I thought I brought mine, but I didn't. It's a small device that generates a PIN code. But this cannot be used for all types of services. There are a number of key services where you can't use a PIN code calculator. More importantly, there are a number of socio-technical requirements. In Sweden, you have to have a bank ID, which means you have to be 18. You have to have a social security number. You have to be a customer at a bank. You have to be able to speak either Swedish or English. In some banks, there are no standard procedures for this. It's because the banks, it's because of the whitewashing rules that the EU have, that the banks require that their customers can communicate with their customers in a language the banks master. So some banks will not take a customer that doesn't speak Swedish or English. And it's up to them, basically the clerk you meet at the bank, to decide whether you speak it well enough. So it's a very sort of arbitrary requirement. And other banks don't care. So there is an alternative in Sweden, the Fire ID. It has a lower entry age. You can use what's called a coordination number, which is not a social security number, but it's a number you can get if you're not, for instance, if you work in Sweden, but live in Denmark or Norway. So you can get that even in some cases where you can't get a social security number, you can get a coordination number, which widens the number of people that can get this ID. You also need a passport or a driver's license, which again narrows it down. To use the whole set of facilities Fire ID offers, you have to go to an authorized fire agent to verify your identity. Someone has to see you and your documentation and verify that it is you. There are a number of them, so it's not like you always have to travel very far, but it's still something you have to be able to do. And the Fire ID services both digital and physical ID. So it's a digital physical ID. Just like I have a physical driver's license, but I also have a driver's license on my phone. So it's like this. And it also allows, which is very interesting, I think, is for an internet proxy user, like a family member or caregiver. None of the other IDs do this, but only 2% uses the Fire ID because most people have a bank account. So they get more or less automatically get a bank ID. And I don't really know. We don't really know why so few people use this, because it has it is more accessible and has some very good features. But this is how it is. Finally, in Denmark, you have to be 15 to get a MidID. You have to have a social security number and a permanent address. Now, these requirements may not seem very onerous, but in fact they are, and I'll get back to this. In Norway, depending on the bank, you have to be 13 or 15, again, a social security number and a permanent address. Now we're looking at this in the perspective of digital inclusion or exclusion. It does matter what word you use. Inclusion is typically used when you look at it as a policy goal, it's something you want to achieve. And often it is used as a sort of a discourse of empowerment. But it may also result in disempowerment. For instance, you don't really have a choice. We're not being digital. And if you choose it, it's somehow you're not a good citizen. You may lack the ability to be digital on the government's terms. You may be online, you may have a computer or a smartphone, but you may not be able to do what the government requires of you. So in practice, you're not digital with government. The fact that you are forced to use it, not by law in Denmark, but in practice in the other countries, may reduce your sense of agency because it's not something you actually decide to do. I've recently, with the organization in Denmark, Ældresagen, which is an organization for elderly people, is the largest grassroots organization in Denmark. About one in every 5 Danes are a member of this organization. It's quite amazing. I assisted them in a study they did where we one of the things we saw that many elderly people that had been able to sort of do things on their own and mind their own life all their lives, all of a sudden this digitalization made them feel disempowered and powerless. So that may be one result. And the ability to choose itself is an essential part of maintaining a sense of self-efficacy of an individuality. So even though inclusion is seen as a policy, a tool of empowerment, it can, for some people, it can have the opposite effect. Exclusion. That's typically the word we use when we focus on the negative effects of digitalization. It can be rooted, and it's often seen as rooted in structural factors, such as the way digitalization has been done by government. And the way digitalization has been done is not just, like I alluded to before, it's not just a question of how the interface is designed or what technical requirements there are. It's also a question of how the whole social, technical, and organizational setup is. For many people, it's not the digital in itself. It is having to do things on your own without access to assistance. And I'm not meaning assistance with pressing the buttons or handling the interface. It's assistance with doing something you haven't done before, where you have no previous experience. It may be important for you to get it done and done it correctly. And if you have to do that on your own without easy access to someone who actually knows something about it and is able to act on this knowledge, it may be very sort of insecure to actually have to do it yourself. So it's not the technology in itself. Often it's a combination of technology, reduced access to skilled assistance, and reduce access to, if in the case of the centralized benefits that are in Denmark, there are no way of actually getting to see anyone face to face, and face to face may in some cases actually still be the best way of handling things. May be the most efficient way, but it also be, you can face to face, you can also take care of some of the things that are very difficult to do online or on the phone. So it is the structural factors go far beyond the sort of basic technology. But it can also be seen as a deficiency. I can see I haven't really gotten, I have a problem with this. It didn't click every time I clicked. Okay. But it can also be seen, and this is actually the prevalent discourse, at least in Denmark, as a deficiency in the citizen. Such as lack of skills or resources. And the focus here is, of course, not on blaming the citizens. Sometimes, in fact, they do blame the citizens, more or less directly, as if they're lazy or stupid. But the focus is on changing the situation, so providing them with the skills or the resources necessary. But again, it's an individualized focus. It's the citizens that have to change, not the system. And it's also amazingly still fairly strong in the literature, this perspective that it's an individual. Of course, there's a strong and growing part of the literature that does not look at it this way, but still a lot of it does. And of course, these issues of exclusion are closely related to issues of social inclusion or exclusion. Otherwise, disadvantaged citizens are also more likely to need benefits and services, so they basically need to interact with governments more often. They may find it more difficult to access and take advantages of digital tools. They may be more likely to need help in doing so. So policies aiming at digital inclusion also have to take the underlying social issues into account. But it's so important here to remember that disadvantaged is not something you are. It's something you are made. And disadvantage is not the disadvantage is not an easily identifiable group. Of course, there are people that, due to various issues in their own lives and the way government handles these issues or don't, are more or less permanently disadvantaged in many situations, but very few people are always disadvantaged in any situation. And also a lot of people, every one of us, are at some points in our lives disadvantaged. We may be in a life crisis, we may be suddenly unemployed, or a close relative has died, or any number of things that happens rarely in our lives and that sort of pulls the rug away under us. And often those situations, we have to do with the most complex sides of government, and with a number of authorities and a number of services and a number of filings, and all this we have to do in a problematic life situation. So we can all be disadvantaged. We, as a growing part of the literature, really prefer to see this as an intersectional issue. So it's embedded and intertwined with systems of power and inequality, and it's shaped by the positionality of individuals within intersecting social orders. So you cannot just look at it as an access issue, as a technical access issue. You cannot just look at it as an age issue. You cannot look at it as an issue of a level of education. It's an intersection of different things that at different situations and different times of life make some people disadvantaged in face of digitalization. Digital exclusion cannot be reduced to a single factor, such as poverty, disability, social circumstances, or being part of social networks. This does not mean that it becomes an individual issue again, because all of a sudden you can end up having sort of everybody's at their own intersection. No, of course not. But it means that we have to look at it a lot more dynamically, and from more angles than we usually do. It's also important to remember that this is a moving target. Changes within the development of technology and the use of technology means that this is always changes, not just because people need new devices. One of the things we saw with this study we did of the elderly was that many of them had a computer they had inherited from a relative, and it was good for everyday purposes, but there were some things they simply couldn't do because it was too old. And they couldn't afford buying a new one. So they were online. And they used it for a number of things, but they were cut off from other things because their equipment was too old. But so there's always this technological development, but there's also changes in the sort of the whole landscape, the social technical landscape. And when government changes other things, organizational things, or how and when and where you can access assistance, they don't always connect the dots. So they don't always see what is the consequences of changing something here, what's the consequences for the whole landscape. But for the citizens, they live in that landscape. So they really need someone to look at the whole picture, but it's rarely done, I'm afraid. Which is, of course, especially an issue if the problems go across sectors, across organizations, across authorities, because then no one is responsible. Yeah, I love this. This is from Helsper, The Digital Disconnect. If you don't know the book, it's a really good book. And this sort of shows that the digital inclusion is based on the good old offline resources. So we often think of it as something separate, but really it isn't. The more resources you can draw on offline, the better you'll be able to benefit from being digital. And also, the more resources you can draw on offline, the less vulnerable you are if things go wrong. Because you have a safety net, you have access to assistance, you may have the money to buy a new device or whatever. So you're more sort of insulated from the problems that some people may encounter. 10 years ago or so, I gave a talk to the committee in the Danish Parliament that dealt with the municipal issues, and it was a sort of a small conference on digitalization, and I was asked to sort of identify 4 barriers, problems that we had to tackle. And when I stood there looking over the politicians, and I just remembered a 5th one, which was them, not because they're politicians, because they have resources, they have large networks, they never encounter what citizens encounter. And I often hear them referring to their family members. Well, my grandmother knows how to do this. Yep, but your grandmother is part of your network, so she probably has access to resources that other grandmothers don't. So it's often the privileged forget their privilege. So this is not a new issue, but it's also the case with the digitization. We have a few examples from the 3 Scandinavian countries of the issues that may arise for real citizens. Tom here is someone I interviewed back in December for a project I'm working on. He's unemployed. He got his mobile phone stolen because he could not afford a new phone. He could not use his mid-ID because he used it via his phone. And he could not get access to the digital post from government, nor could he do the mandatory online check-ins required to continue receiving his social security payments. He could order a PIN code generator, but this required access to his old NemID, the previous version of Danish eID, which he no longer had. With the help of friends, he finally got a used smartphone, but he soon discovered that in a year's time, it wouldn't be upgradable, and he would once again not be able to use his eID. So he was caught in this, and it's not like he could wait, because there is some pretty strict requirements if you're getting Social Security. And of course, you can do it in other ways, but it's very cumbersome, and often, as I said, the staff doesn't really know how. So sometimes they have to sort of basically invent something or do something they're not really supposed to do in order to make things work. This is something we are looking at in a study in the ESOS project, the gray zones of informal work, the informal work that frontline workers, teachers, nurses, and they actually do things they're not supposed to in order to make things work for citizens. This example is from Sweden. Connie had a mild intellectual disability. She was 70 years old and had not been able to get an eID because it's the banks that are the gatekeepers. She's always dependent on help from others, like trustees and service staff, but when no one can help, she must refrain from things she simply can't do. And it's also this issue with help, that there are things in your life you don't want to sort of open up to anybody. It may be health related, it may be something in your past you don't want other people to know about, but which will be visible once you go online in some system. Also, you don't necessarily want to get help with your finances from your children, not because you're afraid what they will do with that information, but because you've managed it yourself all your lives. It's not their business. So getting help, even from people you trust, can be a really big problem for people. During the pandemic, Connie wanted to buy food online as he was in a risk group, but he could not buy food online because he didn't have an eID. In the digitalized world, he considers himself deprived from the same opportunities as others and excluded. I think it's a basic human right to be able to decide for myself when to ask for help. Now I have no choice, I have to ask for help. There was a long series of articles in one of the larger Danish newspapers during last year, where they had a whole range of examples like this. It's great when the press actually are interested, because we have been documenting this for years, but nobody listens. The press might listen. And digitalization is basically designed for the majority. Johanna's mother-in-law lost her code-generating device for her bank ID, so he tried to help her. He contacted her bank and asked them to send her a new code generator. When he explained that he he helped with her bank transactions, they told him he was not allowed to do that because he didn't have a power of attorney. So he was doing something that was illegal. And that she had to get in touch with the bank herself, but she was too fragile and did not have a valid passport anymore, so she couldn't identify herself. She could not get access to bank ID and public health services, so she could not see the results of her COVID tests and hospital appointments. It took 2 years to solve this issue. It's again because if you're on the mainstream, everything's fine. As soon as you get outside it, things collapse because there are no procedures, there are no rules, there are no systems set up to deal with this. The new Danish government, very much pressured by this series of articles in the newspapers, have decided that it should be easier to be exempt from, just as you can get a full exemption from digital post, it should also be easier to be exempt from self-service. So you have one exemption and you're completely exempt. But they haven't really considered the consequences, because this means there has to be good analog alternatives. I'm not meaning we have to get the paper form back. That's often sort of a straw man people draw, but it's not the case. But you have to have alternatives that work. And in many cases, they're not there. The infrastructure is not there. The skills are not there. The people are not there. The procedures are not there. The systems don't allow it. So this is going to be a huge challenge, and I'm not really sure how it will end up because it will cost money and they don't want to spend that money. So this is going to be interesting. So summing up, it's really difficult not to be digital. And it's not just with government. But government, of course, is a special case because there are a lot of things you need to do with government you can't do anywhere else. You can't go to some other provider. And there are things you're required to do, there are obligations you have to fulfill. The consequences go beyond the mere digital. The digital by default idea and self-service oriented public sector policies have implications for inequality in the wider sense. So it's not just a question of digital inequality in the sense that you don't have access and can't take full use and benefit from the digital. It's also that digitalization creates new inequalities outside of the interface, so to speak. And it tends to exclude already disadvantaged groups. And it is an intersectional issue. The number of requirements for getting an EID can be difficult to fulfill, especially for people if they have sort of, and sometimes it doesn't need to be many things that intersect, it can just be two things that all of a sudden makes things impossible. There are several examples of intersections between excluding digital technologies, structural conditions, and the othering that is often created. And people often actually talk about it as a sort of othering because they feel that they're sort of pushed into they're pushed in some ways outside of society because the good citizen is the digital citizen. So by implication, if you're not digital, you're not a good citizen. For example, having a social security number in Denmark, a CPI number, having a permanent address, having domestic or English language skills, having a bank account, or being a bank customer, being over a certain age, having a smartphone, all of this is required. If you're missing one of them, you can't have any ID. Yeah, and this is where we get to the questions and discussion.
Go back to the previous slide.
Yep. This one. Right? Anyone? No? Yeah.
So from this conversation, it sounds that there's a lot of negative aspects of what you do to ID. Let's say the UK got over their whole issue with like
creating mandatory ID numbers and actually wanted to implement digital ID, would you think it would be more harm than good?
No.
Or would it be a good idea to implement it and then just have the same like infrastructure that you want where, you know, they actually also have a face-to-face conversational ability also?
So some of my students, they say, why are you always so negative? I say, because the vast majority of the discourse around this is overly positive. I'm not negative. I just try to find, I look at what's invisible and try to make it visible. So EID is a good idea. The previous version of the Danish one, the NemID, was actually a resounding success. They did botch up the implementation of the new one severely. It was a nightmare the way they implemented it, but it's still the idea is still good, and it works for most people in most cases. The problem is that we only design for the majority. We don't sort of look at the those that are or become or whatever outside and take care of them initially. We don't design for them as well. We can't design a digital solution that will fit everyone. We can do it better than we do now, but we can design procedures, processes, assistance as part of the whole design that will take care of it. We don't. That's what we should do. So if anyone else wants to do it, that's what they should do.
Good morning. My name is Velo Petai. I'm from the European Center for Minority Issues in Flensborg. So just across the border from Denmark. And I have a few questions. I'll be speaking later, of course, on e-government and minorities, ethnic minorities. So this is dovetails very much what you've been talking about. But perhaps two questions. I mean, the first thing, and that's why I asked you to turn the slide back to see that last list of sort of requirements, because the undertone of what you've been saying is, of course, that there is a need to rebuild an infrastructure for people who don't want to go digital as part of a kind of fundamental human right, that people should not be forced to go digital. And then if I look at that sort of core list, in an analog world, if we want to call it that, most of those things would also be required. I mean, you would, if you went to your regular government office, you would be asked for your permanent address, you would be asked for your ID number, you'd be asked to probably, or you would need the relevant language skills, probably even a bank account, although that's a little bit, you know, with pensions are sometimes still paid out in cash to people at home. And as you go down the list, the crux of the issue becomes the smartphone, basically. I mean, maybe that list is not complete, but that seems to be the moment where the digital thing becomes the problem. So everything else is not necessarily a problem of the digital age. It's something that we've had for quite a long time. So I'm wondering how you see that borderline or that Rubicon in terms of the smartphone being the key element. And then the second question is to really go deeper into what you were saying, that is the solution, right? It's not to turn back technology. I'm sure that's not what anyone's arguing. It's going to be there. If 90% of the people are using it anyways, then we're not going to go against the 90% to solve the problems of the 10 or less percent. But then is the policy solution then really to develop the locations where people can go to do all of their government business with face-to-face assistance and perhaps the use of forms and everything else, which I think is feasible, obviously, and it costs something? Or is it, and I'm trying to think of a middle ground, which is that, well, we should have the government offices available, but in order to help people, as it were, get back online. And not necessarily to replicate the whole government system through all of the pension application forms or whatever death certificate forms on paper, but rather because, you know, rather simply to fill the gaps of people who have fallen out of the system, because the two examples that you brought were eminently of people who had fallen out of the system by accident, as it were, or by misfortune. And so in that sense, you could envision the establishment of some kind of help centers, not necessarily, as I say, to replicate all of government in a paper form, but rather to get it, or would that, in your mind, still not be sufficient, as it were, because it doesn't allow people fundamentally to decide they don't want to be digital at all as a part of their human rights. So I'm wondering where you see that policy intervention here going. What should be the proper way to resolve the issues that you addressed? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Now, the first question, before I went back into academia, I was head of a citizen service center in a Danish municipality. And that was before digitization took hold. And we could actually deal with people that didn't have all these requirements. Well, sometimes it was difficult, but because we were interacting face to face, and because we were not as bound by systems as they are today, we could be flexible. We could invent on the spot things that didn't really require anything but me as the boss saying, it's okay, we'll just fix that. I'm not saying that things were great then. I mean, there was lots of issues with the face-to-face encounters and street level bureaucrats and discretion and stuff. But it's still, the digitization has a tendency to lock things in. So it becomes difficult to be flexible when necessary. So it really is not just the smartphone. The other thing is that, as you're saying, that, yeah, well, when the issue, one of the cases, he lost his phone and couldn't afford a new one. Should government provide him with one? Because that would be a solution, or provide him with funds for one. That would be a new thing. That would be a new thing. The other one was she couldn't get a bank ID because she was mentally impaired. That's a decision the banks make. So they would have to legislate to sort of take that decision away from the banks somehow. So these issues are, they are multifaceted, they are social technical, they're not residing in one single point. They are solvable, many of them, they're doable. Again, we will never have to get back to the paper form, that's not necessary. But for instance, if I go to a citizen service center and I need help with applying for some benefit, social benefit, for instance, there are quite substantial requirements for information and documentation and stuff to get social benefits. And it's not something people do often. They may have never tried it in their lives. The rules are pretty complex, and the requirements of the people receiving them are pretty harsh. So I need someone. I can read, I can go online, I have an EID, but I would like to do it with someone that really understands the issues and knows how to ask the questions I don't know how to ask, and can explain it to me in a way that I can understand and where I can make sure that I understand it. So this is not a technical issue. The problem is not doing it online. The problem is doing it on my own. So it's not just a question of access. Again, it's a question of the intersection of many different issues that creates a situation where digital is not the answer or is not the only answer. So I don't think these centers exist in Denmark, and I know in the other countries in some shape or form as well. The places where you can go and get help, but the help they can get, they can give you are very limited. There are sort of in the private, in the third sector, voluntary organizations. They sometimes have a wider mandate, or not. They don't have a mandate. They can do whatever they like. And they often do things they're not supposed to, which is fine. But they also often do things they don't understand. If you go to and sort of the organization for the elderly in Denmark, and you go to someone who can help you with the digital, they will often try and help you with the subject matter of this. But they don't understand it any better than you do. So they may make mistakes because they don't know the rules either. So it is really a question of looking at the whole picture, and not a question of getting back to old technology, so to speak. I see a picture of Karl Erik. Is that because he wants to say something? Yeah, I'm talking all the time. My colleagues are online, so they are very welcome to join.
Also, to kindly remind people following us online, and they can post their questions in the Zoom session or in the WOBA app, and we will be reading them. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Hello, Karl Erik.
Hello, Søren. Hello, Søren. And I agree with you. It's not about removing technology or getting back to paper-based solutions. But the challenges are not just the bank ID or the NEM ID or the MIT ID, but it also has to do with skills. There are a lot of users that have bank ID and are digital sometimes, but are not able to access all the public services without help from friends or relatives. That is very important in certain cases, for instance, when it comes to health issues. And these systems are not always easy to use. So then there's a need for giving power of alternative to relatives. There's a need for getting access to help when needed, and there's also a need for getting manual advice and manual help. So, so it's very much that we have designed the solutions for the majority, which is not 90%, it's less than 90%, but we have designed solutions for the people that have the skills and have the infrastructure in place.
The other thing is that many years ago, I was head of a group of designers, and designers often design for themselves, or for people like themselves. And I think the government has seen self-service as an extension of bureaucracy, to simply extend bureaucracy into the citizens' world, because it's a set of, basically it's the form. The form still lives. It's just morphed into self-service systems. So basically you have to provide the government with information in order for them to do the casework and reach a decision if that's what the issue is. And it's on their terms. It's their terminology. They sort of see the world in a form way. So it's sort of carved up into data. And the online systems don't allow you to deviate. You can't write in the field where you're supposed to write your income and say, well, it depends. Sometimes this, sometimes this. You can't write in the margins. You can't leave something out, and then they'll look it up and figure it out. You have to do it in the right way, or you can't press send. Which is in many cases are fine, because people forget to put in things they know, or in many cases it's fine. But it's still, it reduces the flexibility. And it also means that I've sort of done observations with people that were applying for benefits, and they were doing it on their own with in a job center in Denmark. And I was just an observer, but they made a lot of mistakes. And sometimes I could see they just filled out the form quickly, because once they press send, the process was starting. So they didn't really care if it was absolutely correct, because it was important to do it within a deadline. So in the physical world, what you could do was you could go to the counter with a bunch of papers and a half or partly filled form, and you can say "bah," and we could take it from there. So you can't do this. We pushed a lot of requirements that you previously could, if you wanted to. You could sort of deal with it together with someone that knew something about it. We push that out to the citizens. They have to be their own caseworkers. But they can't always do that. So that's a bigger issue in many cases than the technical part. Someone needs the microphone, so we're waiting for a microphone. But there's someone on. If there's someone is online, we have to.
Oh, I don't want to. Okay, let me just throw my question out, and then allow the speakers involved. I'm interested in coming from where I am in the ethnic minority dimension also of this issue. There's a lot of focus in your presentation, for very good reasons, on ageism. But how do you see these issues applying to immigrant communities in the three countries in particular, because there are also sizable communities in all three countries, and so yeah, perhaps you could speak briefly to that dimension. Thank you.
I think that it's for immigrant communities, assuming that you have an address, because if you don't, there's a number of other issues. But assuming you live in the country and have an address, you already have a number of issues. The language is one issue. I don't think it's quite as bad in Sweden and Norway, but in Denmark it's Danish, or we don't want to talk to you, basically. So that's an issue. It may also, if you're a recent immigrant, be an issue that so the whole culture surrounding your interaction with government is different. Your expectations of how to interact and how they interact are different. So there's a learning curve there. The system may be opaque to people who've lived in the country for many years, but it's certainly opaque for new immigrants. So there's a number of, and often there are a lot of very strict requirements and rules if you're a new immigrant, that things you have to do and mustn't do. And it can be very difficult to actually get a whole picture of this. And at the same time, as soon as you're in Denmark, you have to go online. And that's not necessarily an issue in itself if you have the right documentation and stuff, because immigrants are as digital as anyone else. But it may be, for instance, an issue of online services are based on written language. So if you're not, it's not just a question of knowing the local language, it's also a question of how good your reading and writing skills are. That's actually also a big issue for natives. Quite a lot of people don't have the necessary reading and writing skills to do things online comfortably and securely. And in Denmark, there was the Danish digitization agency, the government digitization agency. They did a study last year where they sort of ended up saying about 20% of the population have issues being digital that are not necessarily connected to the technology itself. That's a lot of people. And again, those 20%, there you find many of the people that use government services the most. Annika, you want to say something?
Hi. Yes, I can just confirm maybe with a case from school and newly arrivals having to have a personal security number to have access to school information and so on. So what I've seen in school studies and where electronic IDs is very much connected to getting information on platforms and so on, people who are newcomers have a lot of problems, not with the language only, but accessing all school information because it's online and digitally locked into a platform, for example. So I think we have a lot of newcomer and newly arrival problematics where you still don't have the language, you still don't have access in the terms of social security and so on. So you really see the obstacles there, I think. And we can also connect, I think you did excellent answers here, Søren. But I just wanted to say one problem which I think we also should look at is the privatization of EIDs. So the market dominance, for example, of the bank ID in Sweden is because most companies or authorities are connected to bank ID and not the other one, which seems to be a better option for many. So, I mean, here's the platform logics coming in, the platform economy. So most customers more connected to platforms, the better service you get and market dominance. So that's also a problem. It's not the best electronic IDs that's being used for the citizens. So I think that's something we can maybe problematize more as well. That's a serious consequence, I think.
If I can just mention, we had the same issue in Denmark, but we got a new version of the digital post system, which actually means that there is a sort of a core system that is government owned, but then you get digital posts from other than government. We used to have 2 access points, one for all your government posts, another was for all your government posts plus, because it was a private company, plus posts from private companies, which was very few people use the government part because they got all of it in one place. That has changed. Now there's competition on the display side. So if a pension company or insurance company wants a cheaper way of sending digital, because it costs money to send digital posts as well, they can go to a competitor that do more cheaply, but then the citizens will have to connect to that competitor as well. So now for instance, I have 4 aside from my work mail and my private email, I have 4 digital mailboxes I have to check to be sure that I've seen everything.
To follow up on that point, because I also come from Estonia, and there, as you probably well know, the digital ID system is actually government-based, and it's the private sector that's actually adopted the government's system. So in this connection, perhaps you could just briefly speak. I know we're coming to an end, but this dichotomy of this choice, and there's much of it is seemingly path dependent, in the sense that now each country has gone down their own paths, and there's not much that can be done because of sunk costs to actually revert back to one that may be seen as better. But what is your take on this idea of government actually introducing chip-embedded ID cards and all of this other stuff that we see in some of the other countries, including Lithuania and others?
In Denmark, it is government. I mean, it's government and the banks, but the government basically has the control of it. So in that sense, it is government owned. But we don't have a chip card. And I don't think we ever will get it because it's sort of outdated. We don't need it anymore. I have a very, very early government EID chip card at home. Back in the 90s, when we thought that was the big thing. And it was on the agenda for a while, but I think we don't need it anymore. I think there are some parts of the sort of the key infrastructure where it's a very, very good idea that it's government controlled. We can discuss if it has to be owned, but it has to be controlled by government because it will improve competition in other areas and it will improve take up. So competition is great, but for some things you need a central control. Yeah.
Hi, yeah. So I missed the beginning, so you might have answered this already, but I had a question around, a lot of these solutions that you're suggesting seem to be quite long term. And I was wondering, especially considering how you found those kind of people who gave their stories, whether that kind of process of finding those people who've kind of fallen between the gaps, whether that might feed into short-term solutions or otherwise how you might see, some of these problems being mitigated through perhaps social work. I know you said that was an option, but what can we do to kind of strengthen that and help more people before opening the system?
Long-term solutions are, well, there's long-term solutions and there's long-term solutions. It's like, again, if you look at the government side of it, there are things we can do in the medium term that are, some of them are technical in nature, others are organizational, to sort of deal with some of the issues, some of the major issues. We also have to, one of the things that we are looking at is to empower friends and relatives, to give them, with the old ID in Denmark, it was based on a paper card with codes, and then you had your online, your phone, basically. And what many people did that had relatives that couldn't quite figure it out themselves, they had their paper card and they had their access code. That's illegal. But that was the way they managed. Also a way some social workers managed with their clients because they couldn't manage it themselves. Again, it was illegal, but it was a way of making it work. With the new mid-ID, that's impossible. So there's sort of all of a sudden this gray area where that everybody knew was happening, but nobody sort of talked about it. They've simply removed it completely, which has created all sorts of problems. So you have to sort of change the mindset of the people who decide these things. So we have to design for the real world. Okay. The other thing is that we have still Denmark, for instance. Denmark is a small country. Sweden and Norway are very big countries geographically. So it's easy in a country like Denmark still to have assistance fairly close by for most people. But in any case, we have to have a much better structure, organization around assistance, and to be much more focused on the skills that the people who assist have, because it's not enough that they can read the same that I can on the screen. It's not enough that they can press the buttons. Because what I ask for help with may be the subject matter. So you have to And that's the problem, is that they've already gotten rid of a lot of people, and they've already saved a lot of money on this. So this is going to be difficult, because I don't really see the solution for this, because, and then you push the issue out into people's network relatives. Not all people have a network they can draw on. You push it into the voluntary sector, where they don't have the skills necessarily. So that's a difficult, it's doable if you decided to do it and you wanted to spend the money. It was possible to do it, and we could do it in a few years' time. So it's more a political problem than a practical problem, I think.
Yeah, we have 5 more minutes if anyone wants to add a question.
Okay, if I can say one final thing, is that it's really, really important to understand that, and I don't think anyone here has that idea, but I often, when I talk to decision makers, there's always this idea that if citizens were just, there's always this idea that citizens are uninformed and they're lazy. And if they just got their act together, things would be quite better. And it's a difficult thing to change, because they don't really ever see them. They don't encounter these people really. But it is, the barriers are, there are some digital skills by themselves are still a barrier for some people, but in Scandinavian countries and in many other European countries, it's not a big issue, because people are online. They do use devices, but they use it for specific purposes, and those skills don't always travel. If you're very good at Counter-Strike, you're not necessarily very good at applying for a government benefit. I mean, it doesn't really map, okay? And even if you're very good at applying for some benefit because you tried it 4 times, then you need to apply for a completely different benefit, which has a completely different setup and a completely different set of rules and completely different set of authorities involved. And then you have to deal with that. That's what I call domain skills. If you don't have the domain skills, you can't. It's like doing a jigsaw puzzle without a picture on the box. You need something to help you, to assist you, to frame it, to give you a sort of mental map that you can navigate, to know that you're doing things in the right way. And people don't have that, they need help. Even well-educated, highly digital people need help. If you don't read and write the local language well enough, then it's very difficult to be digital with government. And it was difficult before as well, but before you had a lot easier access to assistance. You could actually have someone help you do it, and not just someone who could write, but someone who understood the issues, understood your subject matter. So there are so many other issues than the technical ones that we have to take into account. Yeah. Thank you. And thank you, whoever was out there. I have no idea, but thank you.